Hi, I'm Ken Jacobson, Senior Documentary Programmer, AFI Festivals. Welcome everyone to the Q&A for Pray Away. We're thrilled to have back with us Director Kristine Stolakis, the director, producers Jess Devaney and Anya Rous, and special guests from the film, Julie Rodgers and Randy Thomas. Our moderator for this conversation is Michelle Boorstein. Michelle Boorstein, religion reporter at the Washington Post, has covered religion at the Post since 2006. She has chronicled the rise of secularism in the US and broken financial and sexual scandals from the synagogue down the street to the Mormon Church in Utah to the Vatican. She was awarded a Nieman Fellowship in Journalism in 2016 and has won the top honor for big news organizations from the Religion News Writers Association in 2011, 2013, and 2017. Michelle, thank you so much for moderating this conversation, and take it away.
Thank you. So Jess, one of the things I couldn't help thinking when I was watching this very powerful documentary was that it's easy to look at the increased acceptance to LGBTQ people in society, even in traditional Christian circles and institutions. And I just wanted to ask, what motivated you to make this documentary now?
So I run an LGBTQ-led production company with Anya called Multitude Films, and personally grew up evangelical and queer in Florida. And when our executive producer, Daniel Chelfin, introduced me to Kristine Stolakis and the access that she already had and to leaders of the movement, I was really shocked, not only by who she had already gotten on board for the documentary. There were like stars of conversion therapy that I kind of grew up reading their books and watching their speeches and everything. And also with the nuance of her perspective, I had really only heard this topic discussed in ways that were really dismissive and misunderstood the way that conversion therapy is really queer folks' experience of homophobia internalized and then wielded outwards. So it was personally like really moving to get to be a part of this film, and particularly at this time where we're seeing a lot of backlashes to some of the more recent policy and cultural gains for LGBTQ folks.
So speaking of, your decision of portraying people that we don't usually see, Kristine, Jeffrey McCall is such a big figure in this film, and you start and end with him. I wanted you to talk a little bit about why.
Yeah, and thank you, just to say thank you to AFI and thank you to Michelle for getting to have this conversation with you. It's so exciting. And for people who are watching, this is pre-recorded and is actually happening, before the actual festival itself. So it's actually the first time I've gotten to speak about the film at all since we were set to premiere at Tribeca in 2020. And I've since actually had a baby and moved across the country. And also we've all gone through COVID together, which is, a dizzying thing. So to get to sit down and actually have a real conversation about this film is just a delight and feels so long overdue. So thank you to everyone. And thank you to Michelle for moderating. Yes, Jeffrey McCall. So it was really important to me to show audiences that the conversion therapy movement not only continues, but thrives today. It's actually a stereotype and misinformation that you see from both progressives and conservatives, religious or not, that conversion therapy is a thing of the past. And I got to this topic in the first place because my uncle went through conversion therapy for years after he came out as trans as a child. And I experienced his traumatic aftermath of having gone through conversion therapy. And he was one of my caretakers as a child. So I really saw how things affected him in an intimate way. And as I grew up and became a filmmaker, I knew I wanted this to be the topic of my first feature documentary. And I say all that to say that when I started doing research, I thought this was a thing of the past as well. And as a director, you are your film's first audience member. So the fact that I thought that was something that I really remembered throughout the process of making the film. So when we got to editing, we knew we wanted Jeffrey's story, once we got access to a current leader, to start and end the film to really ground all of the history and the analysis of power that the film goes through in the movement today. And specifically, something that Jeffrey shows you is that the movement today, in a way that we see in our culture more generally, is manifesting transphobia and a fight against trans rights and trans dignity. And that was also something that was important in terms of choosing Jeffrey specifically. For now, you've all seen the film, so you know that he identifies as specifically ex-trans, which was important for us to show.
Just to follow up on that, not only showing him, but showing these scenes of people, at that, I guess it was like a party at his home, or I'm not exactly sure what that was. And then in a service, a very powerful religious service there, and the advocacy they were doing on the street with the Freedom March later. So not just showing them, but really showing them, legitimate, like showing them these are people who are of deep faith and their emotions and everything. What were you thinking when you were filming those things and talking to them? How did you feel interacting with them?
It's a great question, and two things come to mind. One thing is most leaders in the movement, and Randy can speak to this directly, and Julie can as well, have good intentions with joining the movement, with taking on a position of leadership, or with participating in conversion therapy in some way. And I felt that deeply with Jeffrey. I think that Jeffrey has really good intentions overall. And the people that he spends time with, I don't want to speak for Jeffrey directly, are also very vulnerable and are hurting. And I felt both of those things when I was with Jeffrey and the Freedom March. And because of those things, people have the conviction of their good intentions, plus they're in a really vulnerable place. There was a lot of pain and a lot of potential for everlasting trauma that were in those spaces too. And that was, in terms of being a filmmaker there, and as someone who, saw a family member go through a lifelong of addiction and depression and anxiety and obsessive compulsive disorder and just a host of mental health issues far after his time in conversion therapy. It's an experience that sticks with you in a way. It just gets into the cracks and crevices of your soul. To spend time with those people doing this now, like in real time, was really intense. It was really, really intense and sad. It was really sad. And those were emotions that we tried to bring to the film in the editing and the making of. But yeah, it was really sad.
Anya, can you talk a little bit more about when you guys say, conversion therapy is not a thing of the past? Is there like modern versions of conversion therapy now that there's, different developments in psychology or attitudes around sexuality and gender? Like, are the modern versions different in some way?
Well, I think that you see, a lot of where conversion therapy takes place is in so many of the different kinds of ways that you saw represented in, Julie's story that you could talk more about, and that you saw depicted in the film, which was not that long ago, but is so much in the sort of form of ongoing counseling and pastoral care and conversations with your pastors or weekly support groups. So much of it is in sort of the day-to-day of how people relate to and communicate and sort of teach, sort of this understanding that it is sinful or somehow that you're broken if you are a member of the LGBTQ community. So part of what we see represented in the Freedom March is part of how the movement sort of in its current iteration, it's a really multi-racial, sort of out in the streets movement that, is with a lot of young people and that is using various forms of sort of social outreach and social media. But so many of the mechanisms, of the narratives, of the ways of sort of propping up the leadership of of people who are sort of directly in the movement as spokespeople, and also incorporating them in the drivers around policy and the ideological right. So much of that continues to happen today.
So some of it's still similar. Is the crux of it, or the theology of it, or is still similar? I see. So Julie and Randy, both your stories are, I mean, you're so open and vulnerable, and it was just, as a viewer, just wanted to hug you. So Julie, there's scenes of you at a church, a church today, overlaid with the younger Julie at the Exodus conferences. And it seems to show you like up front. I wasn't sure if you could talk a little bit about your faith life now, like if you were in leadership at that church, and in those scenes you seem to be, you're interacting with people and you're kind of in the front as a leader, as you have always been, but almost so seem to be kind of thinking on your own. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your faith life now and what you were thinking at those times and what your place is like in the church.
I would say I'm a Christian with a lot more room for mystery now. I am really moved by Jesus, and I'm really moved by Black theologians, Asian American theologians, queer theologians that have been able to recognize that if theology can be used to exclude people and degrade people and cause so much harm, then theology can also be used to liberate people and to create a sense of welcome and hope and joy. And so I am really excited to have finally come into these different communities that are preaching that kind of message of welcome and belonging. And some of it's through teaching fellowship, some of it's through my writing and advocacy work, and more progressive churches and faith communities that I partner with to be able to let young queer people, vulnerable people in those faith communities that I came from know that there is another way to practice their faith, and that if and when they find the courage to leave those communities, there will be a really warm, soft place for them to land.
How did you kind of make that transition yourself? I mean, the movie, the scenes about you talking about this process of hurting yourself and soothing yourself, and then the beautiful scene of your dress with the scars, and it made me want to know, like, what kind of mindset and conclusions did you sort of have to come to get to that place of, I don't know, peace, but more peace?
It was such a long, honestly, gut-wrenching journey. And it was the process of years of realizations. And I would say what moved me the most was seeing the suffering among younger queer people in my communities, and seeing how the same teaching that had caused so much anxiety and depression and self-loathing in my own life and body, that was now happening to these other younger people. And I got to a point when I couldn't participate in that any longer. And when I really started to see that their story was also my story, and that in the same ways that they deserved compassion and life and freedom and joy, like I deserve those things too, I started giving myself permission to believe the faith leaders that said Jesus loved me, and Jesus would love me if I accepted my queer self too. And I started to allow myself to accept the possibility that God loved me and there was life for me outside of a community that likely wouldn't be able to walk with me toward that healing and freedom that I so desperately needed to pursue.
Do you still have a lot of connections with your old community? There was that point when the wedding planner was asking you about including things from your family, and I wasn't sure if that was a complicated question for you.
It is a complicated question. There are a handful of people that have, received me and my story with curiosity and questions, and that's felt like a real gift. There are also quite a few people that I love dearly that haven't been able to walk with me on my journey, that haven't been open to sort of meeting my wife and hearing about my life now. And so I've come to accept that that's okay. I've fallen into, or I guess probably been found by a new community and chosen family that really wants relationship with me, and that's fully me. And it feels pretty amazing to have that. So I hope that some of those people from my past communities will be express sort of a sense of remorse over the ways that they treated me then, and a desire to grow with me. But if they don't, I'm out here living a pretty full, vibrant life, and I just feel grateful for that.
Randy, you had your own journey with that. The film obviously portrays that Lisa Ling event, and then you watching the Prop 8 folks. And I was wondering, like it was described, I think you said, as sort of a real turning point for you. And as Julie said, these things unfold over a period. Was it like that for you, or you kind of had these periods over a long stretch, or was there something about that turning point? Because I'm sure you had heard from queer people who felt they were suffering from, conversion therapy. So what was that for you?
Well, it did happen over the course of a few years. I would say, the first chips at that wall, that hyper spiritualized wall that I always erected anytime professionals or people or families would come to me with, the truth that this doesn't work and that it's damaging and destructive and deadly. That hyper spiritualized denial was starting to be chipped at in 2008 when we were involved in public policy. And as I watched the marriage amendments passing across the country, and then Prop 8, and that voice in my head as I'm watching really my community out in the streets mourning that once again they had been relegated to third-class status, that they had been once again oppressed by having their rights stripped away. And I had been a part of that. And as I watched who I knew deep down in my heart was my community, mourning, grieving, protesting, that still small voice said in my head, how could you do this to your community? And that was the first chip. Over the years, we began questioning people like Julie, the younger generation. They were asking all kinds of questions. Is Exodus really fulfilling its mission? Is it really change? We know what we mean by temptation, but is that really not changing? And we started asking these questions, and truthfully, Exodus had been asking those questions for over 30 years, but it became it came to a head again, and the old guard was not having it. And then in 2015, fast forward 7 years, we were already in the midst of a humongous nonprofit version of a denominational split. The three networks of 251 member agencies were in an uproar because we were saying that gay people who said they were saved probably are, and it's okay to recognize that. And this is back when I'm still in all that, conservative, all that good stuff. But we started saying once saved, always saved. And it was just unbearable. It was one of the worst times in my life. And then that culminated in January of 2015 when my friend Michael committed suicide. And I wish that I hadn't hyper spiritualized away all the families that had lost people, all the people who had so much destruction in their lives. It took someone close to me feeling like God was punishing him, and that was his only option, to rip my blinders off. And at that exact same time, I was already preparing a report to the board of directors for Exodus on whether we should stay open or not. And I had already decided it should close. But when Michael took his life, I knew that whether the board approved it closing or not, I had to get out because this was not working. I couldn't hyper spiritualize away Michael. I could not dishonor him by continuing to promote this ideology that took his life. And so that was the eye-opening moment for me. And it was, years in the making, but it took that awful tragedy to open my eyes. And everything I do to help to try to end conversion therapy in its pastoral form and ex-gay ministry is to honor his life by speaking the truth and living mine.
Does it seem, as someone who was involved in policy, Randy, does, the film talks about, if I understood it right, that there was kind of a period in the historic arc where it became more political, that the movement went more into direct policy advocacy and stuff. What about now? Is your sense that, it's just as political and policy oriented, more so? Does it look like a different version today?
It's the same toxic theology. It's like this virus of thought to stigmatize the LGBTQ community. That underlying point is the exact same. What's different now is this cynical, tragic, abusive approach in trying to stigmatize trans people. It used to be gay males, that society had a thing against gay males, so let's expose this, that, and the other about them. But now they've transferred that to the trans community, unfortunately, are one of the most vulnerable of our community. They're targeting because they know that the cultural stigma against the trans community is so high. And so even today, here in my state of Florida, our governor signed an anti-trans kids bill telling that trans kids can't participate in the sports that their gender says that they should. And so we've got legislation out now, and trans issues are the target, because the number one goal that I remember is to stigmatize LGBTQ plus people as much as possible in public policy, and numbing of the conscience, saying, well, we've got ministries out there to help them. But instead, they're just wanting more power. They're wanting to oppress and disenfranchise. And that has not changed. The target has changed, unfortunately.
I could just add one thing there, something that didn't make it in the film, but is true, speaking from a political angle for a second, is even in the 2016 Republican National Platform, there was a line in the platform that was added because of lobbying from the Family Research Council in support of families having choice in terms of what type of therapist they bring their kid to. And that was in order to have kids be able to go to practicing potentially conversion therapists, is what we would call conversion therapy. And I guess I mentioned that to say there's also, just in mainstream conservative Christian culture, ways in which it's not even that change. Well, there's not even too much of an attempt to change what conversion therapy might look like. I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's like what am I trying to get at here? That even in mainstream political Christian culture, conversion therapy keeps rearing its ugly head, I guess is all I'm trying to say. It's not just rebranded here and there. It really just has continued. And that was something I didn't really understand until I started doing research on the film.
I see. Jess, is that your sense as well in terms of a big surprise? I mean, you said you grew up in, more of a conservative Christian community. So was it a surprise to you that it was still going on as much, or what were you surprised about by your filmmaking and reporting for this?
It wasn't a surprise to me. My family still lives in Florida. My little brother is in his 20s, is also gay. And I went to Christian college in Florida. Many of my friends went through this like around Julie's era. So it wasn't a surprise to me that it was still happening. But what became a surprise to me through the making of the film was this felt so clearly like the most urgent issue that we needed to be talking about in terms of LGBTQ dignity, and in terms of the way that it's informing anti-trans legislation and other anti-LGBTQ legislation, and that its persistence in terms of the impact individually and socially on queer folks is so harmful and detrimental that ending it is one of the biggest contributions that we can make to LGBTQ dignity. But when we were having a lot of conversations in terms of fundraising for this film, many gatekeepers who are often straight were coming back with the question of like, is this really happening? Is this the most urgent issue facing LGBTQ folks? And I think there was a real misunderstanding for many of those gatekeepers who are largely in New York and LA, or like hubs where their queer friends are out at parties and we're not like digging up our old sad stories to offer over cocktails, you know? So there's not a full understanding of the different intersection of traumas that we are bringing to our relationships with them. So getting to contribute this to the public conversation within the industry and within the broader public is really meaningful.
Anya, is that also, I was just going to wrap up with saying, just to think about what the main point you wanted people to take from the film was. And obviously Jess was making a strong point for that, for that one thing, for people to still understand that conversion therapy is very real. Do you feel like there's other key things you'd like audiences to take away from it?
Well, if this is the last word, I want to give it to Kristine, because this has been her project of 5 years, and we've worked so closely with her, in terms of, so a cultural change approach is something that's really integral to what Multitude Films is about, and to making compelling films that change the way that audiences relate to and understand these issues. And there were a number of things that we want to do with this film, and but I also just, so much of that clear vision really originated with Kristine. So I'm happy to have her speak to that.
I think we just have 1 more minute, but yeah, speak to that if you could, Kristine.
Thank you, Anya. And just to end us then, I think what I was trying to get at before, and you have to pardon me tripping over my words. This is me on a 2.5-month baby old sleep schedule that I now have. And anyway, I'm definitely a new experience that I'm rolling with. But yes, in terms of a final word, in terms of a takeaway from the film, what I really learned is that conversion therapy is not just a practice, but a movement. And that makes it incredibly powerful. So even if you have someone like Randy, who decides to leave the movement, like Julie, who decides to leave the movement, there will always be, as long as transphobia and homophobia continue to persist in our culture, there will be an environment in which new potential leaders and participants are essentially bred to continue the movement, to continue to fuel the movement. And that was something we really wanted to be clear. We really wanted to make clear in the film. This is not a story of a few bad apples. It's really a story of a culture of harm that perpetuates harm. And if people, I think, can grasp that, I think that there's a real way we can share a dialogue about how to meaningfully end this movement.
Well, thank all of you so much for talking with me and answering my questions and engaging. And I wish you all success with your film. And let's go back to Ken.
Thank you, Michelle, and thanks to our filmmakers and those of you who are in the film. We really appreciate this thoughtful conversation. And I just want to thank our audience for being with us today as well. And I want to urge them to please tell your friends that this film is available to screen until the end of the festival. We'd love to hear from you on social media at #AFIDOCS. And you can join us for more films and virtual events at docs.afi.com. Thanks, everyone.